let's just open with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Dear Lord, thank you for this morning where we could come to your house and worship and witness Mac's ordination and the great event that was. Please be with him in his ministry, and please be with this discussion today and help it to be somewhat insightful at least, and that I could clearly communicate the ideas that I hope to. In your name we pray, amen. All right, so this talk, I was trying to come up with a catchy title, so maybe I succeeded. It's not exactly about being introverted, but it's more about isolation, and are we spending too much time alone as a society? So just to introduce, I thought I'd explain a little bit who I am. Some of you hopefully know me, some of you may not know as well, but I'm currently a deacon at the church, and it came up in a council meeting like, wow, it'd be nice to have, some variety to the speakers, maybe some less academic people that really know what they're talking about talk and see what they come up with. And I thought, wow, that sounds like me. So you'd be surprised, the application process is actually pretty easy, so hopefully I don't ruin that for all of you. But yeah, that's how I ended up here. I thought maybe this was at least something we could talk about for a day. I'm also a CPA and investment advisor, so I do taxes and work with investments. So that should help you understand that I am an introvert, so I'm not against introverts. I think they're great. It should also help you understand it's been a busy week. So we'll see how this goes. I don't know if I had quite as much time to prepare as I was hoping for. I'm also almost 33, okay? So this talk has a little bit of historical context, and you can understand, I'm not speaking from experience, but, some studies and other things I've read. And also, it should just give you context on a few things. Last thing I'll tell you is I love to watch TV, be it sports or other shows or anything. So if you ever want to talk about that or come to our Survivor watch party, let me know. But that just to say that I'm not against TV. I love TV, so if it comes up that it seems like I just don't like doing fun things, that's not really the point of this either. So that's a little bit about me. Now, where did this topic kind of come from? It's based mostly, I would say, on an article I read. It's called The Antisocial Generation. There's a podcast that goes with it, and it was from Derek Thompson. He's a writer for The Atlantic. He is not a Christian, but he has a lot of good stuff to say, and I think he communicates fairly clearly. So that was one of the articles that inspired this. There were also, we have sermons on community from time to time, and it's kind of been a topic that I find interesting. And then there was one other article called Songbirds Fly at Night, which was from Table Talk magazine, and that was more of the Christian view of it. So, all right, that's a lot of background, but let's jump in. So today, kind of the hypothesis that we're going to be looking at is one, as a society, are we becoming more and more isolated from each other? So that's kind of the first point we'll look at. And then the second point that goes with that is that this isolation negatively impacts us. So one, are we actually becoming more isolated is the first question. Two, does this negatively impact us? And then, why do we as the church care? Pastor Dahlman, I thought with his church history study, was like we should always be asking, why does this matter to us as Christians? Why is this worth talking about? So these were kind of the questions I thought of that made sense. One, we should be aware of what's happening in the world around us that we live in, right? So if we are becoming more isolated as a society, what does that mean for the world we live in? We should know that that's happening to us and others. Then within the church, are we becoming more isolated from the world? right? Is the church becoming more isolated? And two, even within the church, are we becoming more isolated? And finally, if that's the case, does that negatively impact the church and God's kingdom? So that's kind of the questions. We'll see if we actually answer those, but those were the things I hope to talk about. So we'll start for the case for isolation. So are we really becoming more isolated? And to look at that, it seems like going back in history, is kind of the thing to do. Remember, I'm 33, so I did not live in the 1990s to 1960s. Maybe a few of you here, actually, but probably not even the majority of us lived in a large portion of that time. But from my understanding, I want to be kind, but there maybe wasn't a lot to do at your house, you didn't have TV. You basically, maybe I don't know what you did, read books, if that's what my grandpa would say. But there were a lot of things you were involved in, right? You had church, You might have been part of a union where you hung out at the union hall and, I don't know, played pool. Almost everyone was married, so you had time with your spouse and families. There was the baby boom, so you had a lot of kids to deal with. Things to do like that. Movie theaters, had come around, so that was kind of a form of entertainment if you were allowed to go to the movies at some point in that time period. There were all things you did kind of in your community. Book clubs, I mentioned reading. A lot of things going on outside of the home, right? You met in the town square and, talked about politics and stuff like that. But basically in the 1900s to 1960s, there was this period where you're not spending a lot of time in the home, and there's more to do in the community, right? You can accept that if you want. You'll have a chance to talk about that with your neighbor in a second. Then there was the 1970s to the 2000s, and I don't know if there's this book called Bowling Alone, and that's where a lot of these ideas come from. But basically the idea is in that time period, two main things happened. The automobile became much more popular, and the television set became much more popular. And basically what this did was, one, people could kind of expand where they lived, With the car, you could live in the suburbs outside the city, so one, you were already a little farther away from each other. And then two, you had the television set. So all of a sudden, your entertainment could be inside the home, and you didn't have to go, somewhere else to get your entertainment. You didn't have to go to the real theater. You didn't even have to go to the movie theater. You could watch things at home. You didn't have to go to the Brewer game and be with other people. You could all of a sudden watch at home, So those were the two main things that happened. It's basically the rise of individualism, right? We as our family unit, or even me as myself, can kind of provide for myself, my own entertainment, all the things I want to do. I thought of this yesterday, actually, because we were cutting down some, what are they called? Buckthorn trees, And I had my dad come over and bring his chainsaw. And one thing you should know about me, remember I said I'm 33, very scared of chainsaws, but I was like, this is probably the age in my life where I need to learn how to use a chainsaw. And it went pretty well, It's really easy to cut through things with a chainsaw. So we got all the trees down, and my wife, Emily, says, see, now I was like, that was pretty nice using a chainsaw. And she's like, now, do you agree with me we should have put that on our registry for our wedding? And I didn't really want to admit I was probably wrong about that. So I said, well, yeah, but then I wouldn't have got to talk to my dad on Saturday morning, right? And I kind of was joking because I didn't want to be wrong, right? But as I was thinking about it and trying to justify it more in my head, I was like, that kind of ties into this rise of individualism, right? If you all have your own chainsaws, You don't ever need to talk to anyone to get their chainsaw, right? You don't ever need help cutting something down. Similar, if you all have your own TVs, you don't ever need to go over to someone's, well, you go to the town square, go to the movie theater, watch it, right? So that happened, in the 70s to 2000s. Just some notes on that. So they estimated from 1985 to 1994, active involvement in, so that's only a 9-year period, right? 1985 to 1994, active involvement in community organizations fell by nearly half, okay? So, how they define community organizations, I would guess is, I'm not sure exactly, but think of maybe what you're involved in the community, other than church. I don't know that it would be much for me, but that fell by half. And then in 1970, they said 6% of sixth graders had a TV in their bedroom. And by 1999, that was 77%. Okay, so quite a big jump. And then we go forward even a little further to the 21st century. And now all of a sudden, what do we have? Phones, tablets, okay, AirPods, iPods. Now you went from, movie theater, you're all together watching a movie, to television. Now I can watch that maybe with my family. Now I have my phone or a tablet. Now I'm watching just by myself, right? So even within your family, you're becoming more and more, everything's catered just to what you are looking for, okay? You're almost in your own world, and that's even expanded to things like news, right? You no longer all watch the same news program on TV or read the same newspaper. Now I get my news on Twitter, and it's basically curated with just the people that I want to hear from, or I can stream it from whatever service I want. So you can kind of just see the progression of how things have become more and more individualized. Add to that things like working from home. Okay, with technology, it's easy to work from home. That's great for some people. You're also alone a lot, right? Especially if no one else works from home. You have Uber Eats, DoorDash. You don't even have to go to the restaurant. You don't even have to say thanks to the person. They just drop it on your doorstep and text you. So none of that is like inherently bad, right? There's great uses for all those things. Like I said, I love watching TV. I would argue at least with TV, there's like other people can watch with you. But yeah, you can kind of see the trend, right? And it was accelerated by COVID, right? The work from home, all the individualized stuff. But I think the point, especially that the author was making and that I would agree with, is that this was happening before COVID, and it's still happening now after COVID. So I don't think we can just blame it all on that. So that's kind of the historical case, okay? I think there's also just some anecdotal evidence, right? You can look at your own lives and see, you hear people all the time, oh, well, we used to have these potlucks after church, and we just all, would stay and eat, and it was so great. You talk to other people, and they're like, yeah, I would play with my friends, as we were walking up the hill to school both ways, and then we would play every day, right, and hang out, and our parents were never around, and we just did all these things that seemed pretty dangerous, but we had a lot of fun. But even more recently, right, there's a lot of, you have a get-together, and then, someone cancels last minute because they're not feeling well, or, a lot of canceled plans. Screen time is a big thing. How often do you have people over for dinner? All those types of things. So the anecdotal evidence, it also just seems kind of right? If they're telling us this through history, you also get the sense that it just seems kind of correct. So maybe just take 2 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes, we'll say, talk to a few people around you and discuss, do you think society in your lifetime has become more isolated? And why, maybe? And why? Seems like some strong opinions. General consensus. Yes, you're on board so far? Okay. All right. Then I'll just list for you some of the stats then that I think also seem to support this. So from the late 70s, and remember these are stats, so they're percentages, so they're a little hard to comprehend sometimes, but try to think of them maybe as, if you're saying, using a 4 hours or something, when you're talking about time increasing or decreasing, try to put a time amount on it, and then you can get a little bit of a sense perhaps. But from the late 1970s to the late 1990s, so approximately 20 years, the frequency of hosting friends for a party or a game night or a dinner declined by 45%. Okay, so if you did that maybe twice a week, you're almost down to once a week in that 20-year period. And then in the next 20 years, okay, it declined another 32%. So that's from the 70s now to the, what would that be, late 2010s, okay, you decreased another 32% above the 45%. Okay, so that's what? Percentages are a little tricky, but that's a big decrease in that 40-year period, okay? In 2022, adults spent 99 more minutes at home than at any given day from just 2003, okay? And if you would go back even further, right, it would be an even bigger decrease. So that's like an hour and a half. You think an extra hour and a half, you were maybe about in the community with others only 20 years ago. In-person socializing plunged more than 20% in the last 20 years, and it's not just a COVID thing because in 2023 the stats were actually worse than in 2021, which was kind of right in the heat as we were kind of coming out of things. So it hasn't gotten better since then. And then for young people, actually, this is more of even the concern, okay? So I would say of the people in this room, right, this probably applies to us, this whole topic, even less than most people, right? We're relatively affluent, okay? These trends seem to apply less the more affluent you are. And we're all part of a church community already, right? So you're already here on Sunday. Worst case, right, you're spending, 90 to, well, maybe not 90. Well, depends who's preaching. 60 to 90 minutes together. Okay. And you guys are all here, so that's another amount of time. But think of people who aren't a member of a church, right? Who are even younger. They didn't even grow up, in the 90s when before that extra 30% drop, right? So this trend was actually the worst for people under age 25, and they declined. Their in-person socializing declined 35% in the last 20 years. Okay. The number of students who said they met up with friends almost daily outside school hours has declined by 50% since the early 1990s. And this is kind of the big one. The average teenager spends 30% of their waking life looking at their phone. So I don't want it to be like an anti-technology thing, right? I'm not really anti-phone, but I think the impact, I guess it's the effect. The effect of the phone has been more, I'm just living in this kind of individual phone world and I'm not interacting as much with the people around me. So just to summarize, where we're at right now. So we are spending more time alone, I think. I think our experiences, the stats seem to back that up. It's getting worse. It's not getting better. as time goes on, and it seems like the youngest people among us are impacted the most. All right, so then it kind of goes to the second hypothesis, that this is bad for us. So why? Where do we see that? I think starting with the younger people among us, we've seen effects in society, right? Kids are getting married later. I'm one of those, right? They're driving later. They're getting jobs later. The overall trend seems to be kids are growing up a little slower. And that I don't necessarily know is a negative effect, but it's definitely, something that's happening. I would say the big thing, right, is teen anxiety and depression is at basically all-time highs for every study you look at. Okay, a lot of people seem to blame that on phones and just phones in general, social media. I would perhaps say maybe it has something to do with, not spending enough time with other people, which, again, you can make that connection. And young men especially seem to be increasing alone time faster than any other group. So that's kind of what's going on with kids. Adults, though, too, it's impacting. The stat that it's a little hard to understand, but luckily I think something happened this week that'll help us understand a little, is they did a study and they said a 5% increase in alone time was associated with the same decline in life satisfaction as a 10% lower household income. Okay? So you can think how you felt this week after losing 10% of your wealth in the stock market, okay, in the last 2 days, and maybe think that's a similar feeling as spending 5% less time alone, or spending 5% more time alone, okay? Now, I don't think this extrapolates in a perfectly straight line, but you can imagine now you're not spending 5% more time alone, you're spending 30% more time alone, right, which is kind of what the stats are saying. Okay, are you like 60%? Would that be like cutting your income by 60%? Probably not, but let's say 30 to 40%, okay? So basically, you're living in like a 2008, 2009 in terms of wealth constantly in terms of happiness. Now, I don't know that it works exactly like that, but you kind of get the idea. Spending more time alone is associated with a decline in life satisfaction. And that's, I think that also checks out, right? Even for someone like me who doesn't always want to talk to people, usually when you end up talking to people, you do feel, better, and you feel better living in community. So we all seem to agree that we're a little better off when we're interacting with other people. It's just no one likes to do it. Well, not, some of us don't like to do it. And then there's this idea of isolation versus loneliness, okay? And loneliness is actually not at an all-time high. There are a lot of people who are lonely, but actually the problem they're seeing now is that people are no longer lonely. So loneliness is basically you have this feeling of, I'm lonely, I would like to interact with other people. And being isolated is basically, I'm by myself, and that's normal. I don't feel like this is something that's a problem or needs to change. It's just the way it is. So isolation is rising, but loneliness is kind of, yes, Eric.
Do you think some of that is because we're getting this synthetic aspect of connection through our electronic devices, and we think we're not lonely, but we actually are lonely? We're just not realizing it?
I'm not a medical expert, but I would say that's my interpretation, right, is you're filling kind of these loneliness voids with other things. Whether it's your phone, and we'll get to that a little later. So that's kind of what's happening, right? And the quote that really stuck with me with that is, it used to be, the quote was, I'm alone and sad, I should try to make some plans, okay, to see other people. And now it's kind of become this idea, especially among young people, I'm alone, anxious, and exhausted, thank God my plans were canceled. right? And you can stay at home. So I had one more prompt, but we're not going to talk about it. But just when was the last time you had a non-family member over for dinner? You can think about that, and maybe we'll have time at the end. But the last kind of negative effect that I want to talk about is this polarization idea in society. And basically the idea that society has become more polarized. And I think that's fairly easy to agree upon, from your experience as well. And the thinking behind that is basically we're not seeing as many people, and it's a lot easier to have disagreements with people that you don't know or interact with. And that ties into this. It's kind of a hard chart to see because I did not spend too much time finding that. But there's 3 circles, okay? So the beginning circle is the inner circle, number 3 is your family, okay? And actually, contrary to everything we've said so far, people are actually spending more time with their families, okay? You're in the house more. You can connect all the time over cell phone or FaceTime. So we're actually spending more time with our families. The second ring is what they call the village, okay? And this is the people just around your family. In our case, it would be people like church, but people in your community, your neighbors, okay? People that you would meet at softball or name the activity, okay? That's actually way down. That's the people that you're not spending much time with, they're finding. And then you have this outer circle, which they call your tribe, okay? That's maybe a little what Eric is referring to. These are basically the people that you're connected with kind of online, maybe, right? You could be in a forum or some Brewer fan thread where you talk to all Brewer fans online, and that's all of your, you have this community online, right? And that's way up, but you never actually meet them in person, okay? And that has had an impact in that because you don't know them, okay, it kind of impacts your thinking a little of how the world works. So let's say, one example I could think of, not to rip on guys who like golf too much, but right, you're in a Facebook group with all dads that love to golf or something, and it becomes like, we golf 96 holes a week or whatever. And then you start thinking, okay, well, I only golf 72 holes a week, so I'm doing like a really good job, being there for my family and all that. And you're just kind of stuck in your community level 1, right? And if you would just go into like level 2 and talk to some people, at church or your neighbors, and they're like, you're playing 72 holes of golf a week? Like, that's a lot of golf, and all of a sudden, your whole reality might be changing a little, whereas like you thought one thing was kind of normal because that was what your tribe was talking about, but if you would just go into the village and talk to them, you might get a vastly different perspective. So, you can apply that to all sorts of things, but that's just an example of how we're kind of cutting out this middle ground. And obviously, we're at church, so that's hopefully part of that, but something to think about as you're going out into your community a little. Okay, we have to keep. Well, I'll just read this quote real quick that kind of wraps up that idea. Home-based, phone-based culture has arguably solidified our closest and most distant connections. The inner ring of family and best friends, and the outer ring of tribe, linked by shared affinities, but it's wreaking havoc on the middle ring of familiar but not intimate relationships with the people who live around us. These are your neighbors, the people in your town. We used to know them well, now we don't. Okay? So that may or may not be true with you. I think it's definitely probably pretty true for me. But we only have a few minutes left, so let's jump into the church part of it. Okay? What does this mean for us as a church? Why do we care? So I think the main thing to point out is, right, one of our core values is community, right? And if we're not spending as much time together, are we fulfilling that core value of community? So are we doing any better than the rest of society who seems to be struggling with this. So I think the first thing is to look inward, so at our church, okay? Are we as a church becoming more isolated from each other? And I think, I don't know, that's a tough thing to answer, right? We on the one hand, we come to worship every week and spend a lot of time together. We have life groups, okay? I'm sure you have friends from church that you see outside of those things. But one, is that happening with everyone? Okay? Not everyone's in a life group. Not everyone stays for Adult Ed. Not everyone stays for Lemonade. So I would say definitely it's happening in some ways and not in others. But how well do we know each other, right? We talked about this in our life group, actually, and someone brought up a pretty good point that I won't reveal their identity, but it was basically, we had the whole women in office discussion, right? And they said coming out of that, what they were really surprised by was afterwards, okay, after the decision was made, how surprised people seemed to be on both sides of, one, wow, I can't believe there were that many people who didn't want women in office. And on the other side, wow, I can't believe there were that many people who did want women in office, right? Both sides were kind of shocked. And they kind of made the point that this maybe applies a little to that is, we're in a community as a church, but how often are we actually interacting and talking about, things that matter? How well do we actually know each other? And that kind of ties in with, are we holding each other accountable, right, to walking with Christ? Are you really doing that if you don't know someone or spend enough time with them in their life group? How can you really hold each other accountable? And are we really forming and pushing each other forward to the goals of the kingdom, if you barely interact with each other, right? How can I hold Chris accountable to walking in his faith if I don't really ever see him outside of church, So that's looking inward, some of the ideas. Looking outward, I think, is another thing to consider. So are we becoming more isolated from the outside world? I think the first thing to look at is, are we being a light to the outside world, right? So we just heard all the stats about how people are becoming more isolated, okay? If they're not in a community, which there's a lot of people not in a church community, right? They may be looking for that community. And we should be aware of that as a church to know kind of, all right, if you find someone who is lonely, they lonely in that they're looking for a community, you can explain to them the community of Christ, but kind of know where they're at. And also, are we making sure to stay connected to those outside the church, right, to learn more about God's world and his kingdom? Okay, so are we so stuck in our little bubble, right, in our church bubble, that we're not learning enough about others? So let's see. I thought I had a quote, but I think I got rid of that one. But basically, right, are we so in our echo chamber, right, is our social media all telling us the same things about, oh, those people outside the church are so terrible, or even that part of, the church who believes that, we need to stay away from them, that we're even becoming isolated as a church and not interacting with those outside of who we are. So it's kind of the idea of the Imago Dei, and that's in the last article I had mentioned, that if we are really a church that's supposed to be reflecting the image of God, okay, and God is God of the whole world and creation, then we need to be aware of what's happening in the world and all his creation. And if we're not interacting with the world, we can't know that, right? So it's just a reminder to, when we're looking to build community, okay, we shouldn't only be looking to those inside the church, but also to those outside of the church, so that we can learn from them and reflect God's glory. So, a few minutes left. I always like to have a few takeaways. So the one would be, what do we do? I think you got to just start doing it a little. They did this whole study, on trains where they asked people to go on the train and start talking to someone, And what they found was, one, people always ended up enjoying the conversation more than they thought they would. So they asked them before, how much would you enjoy talking to someone? And then they asked them after, how much did you actually enjoy it? And it was always higher afterwards. They thought another takeaway was they said the reason people didn't want to start a conversation is because they always thought the other person didn't want to talk to them. And it turned out that wasn't true either. I know that's a big one for me. I'm sure they don't want to talk to me. Turns out it's not the case. So our mistaken preference for solitude could emerge from a misplaced anxiety that other people aren't interested in talking with us, or that they would find our company bothersome. So apparently that's not the case. So you should just start talking with people and see what happens. I've tried to do it a little bit. It's often very awkward, and I don't know, but it's sometimes kind of fun. No one's been mean, So what do you have to lose? It's also a group effort, right? Especially, I think, when we're talking about the tighter, village community. So another quote they had is, a teenager is more likely to get out of the house if his classmates have already made a habit of hanging out. That teen's parents are more likely to host if their neighbors have also made a habit of weekly gatherings. So you might have to be the first one who's sure, let's have someone over for dinner, or let's host this. But if you end up receiving that, or you see other people in your community doing that, I think you gotta not be afraid to jump on, and once it becomes a little more normalized, you might decide you actually enjoyed it. The other kind of thing with that is our smallest actions create norms, our norms create values, our values drive behavior, and our behaviors cascade. So that was a quote from a non-Christian guy in the article, but I think that's kind of a very Christian idea, right? That's why we have rituals and liturgy and that type of things. All these small actions kind of form how we live, and they're important. So maybe it's a small action of, I'm going to try to talk to 2 people after church that I don't usually talk to, and that starts to create a value in you that you're talking and showing love to others. And then kind of the last thing is there is maybe this bigger idea, right? I mentioned before that the affluent, and especially white affluent people and older people are the people struggling with this the least. So, if you take the inverse of that, right, then young, poorer, minorities are probably the people struggling with this the most. So the last quote I gave is, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to poor neighborhoods in big cities, and the community leaders tell me the real crisis for poor teenagers is that there's just not much for them to do anymore and nowhere to go. So does that sound about right? Especially with, crime and other things, right? It's kind of well, why don't you just stay at home and play video games, or, go on your phone? So, can the church be a place where, people can come and find community, whether it's just a event or something like that? So again, that's a little bigger of something than just going to talk to someone, but I think there's probably ideas there of how the church can start to, provide some of that community. So I think that's it. I don't know that we really have time for questions, but I will stay up here a while if you want to talk. So thank you.